It is 12:02. We're going to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today for our next presentation in our Design Land App series. And in case you are interested in more events, obviously you found this one, but if you would like to see the rest within the series, it's just our digitaldesign.tulane.edu/events website. So I'm Amanda Garcia. I am the program director for our digital design, PR, and digital media marketing programs here at Tulane SOPA. And today joining us for the presentation is Professor Rebecca Carr, and she is one of our professors of practice digital design. And we also have Professor Samantha Barnes on the call as well, who will be taking questions as we move through this. Okay, so we're going to be talking about how to use type to elevate your message. As we're going through the Zoom, if you have any questions that may come up, feel free to just click in the comment box to ask any questions that you might have. And the three of us on the call from Tulane will be happy to kind of monitor that and you know, in the chat box, I'm sorry, and we'll monitor that and answer any questions that you may have as we move through this. So Ellen Lupton, who is an amazing design educator, she stated that typography is what language looks like. And this couldn't be true. So type of design with just if an image is worth words, right? Typography enhances that even more. And typography is the study of lettering and fonts. And so you're going to hear the word very clearly today. Also going to give you type terms and type tips and tricks as we move through this. So please pause at any time and ask additional questions. Okay, so typography conveys information and a message. It can set the mood right away, even before the viewer begins to read. So this is, you know, something that we want to enforce in terms of lettering itself, choosing fonts, the way that type and image work together. For example, when you're choosing different typefaces, letter forms can appear friendly or aggressive just in the design of the typography itself. So obviously on the left, when you see the word friendly, this is typeset and Arial rounded, you can see how the rounded end caps of the letter forms themselves feel very friendly, right? So just typesetting in the word friendly obviously conveys friendly, but the way the lettering itself looks further reinforces the meaning. Whereas over here on the right, the word aggressive, it's bold, it's all caps, you know, it gives that feeling of aggression. So once again, yes, the word says aggressive, but the lettering itself also conveys the feeling of aggressive. Also, when we're looking at type, typically when we're choosing fonts, right? So we joke in our classes and we tell students not to use the F word, which is fonts. So we kind of joke about that in our studios, but what that really means is type and typography are the right terms to use when you're referring to a font. So type can feel traditional, it can feel modern, it can feel calming, it can feel chaotic, right? So as we're looking at all of our examples and a couple of our little type rules and tips today, I want you to really think about everything we're talking about, how typography aids or hinders communication, because the field of design is all about visual communication. So everything from the image, the color, and as well, of course, is the typography that is. So just in our everyday lives, high level, before we dig in, you know, type plays such role in accessing critical information, even as this example states, glance at high speeds, right? So when you're looking at signs along a highway, typography is giving you information, but we have to choose the right typefaces that make it easy to understand. It has to be clear. The letter forms can't be too close to one another. So type can be a matter of life and death in some situations, right? So we have to be mindful designers when to choose the right typefaces. Also over here on the right side, when we're looking at the subway signage, you know, using typography and color to create meaning and add meaning, make it easy once again to communicate for the viewer to understand. So this, you guys remember when Target redesigned their bottle packaging for their pills and their medications, and you know, this is a really inventive way to do this, looking at hierarchy, thinking about how the end user, our target audience as we call them, right? How our target audience is using and reading these medication labels, and how the bottle was flattened so that it can be read very easily all at once. So really taking into account hierarchy we've talked about before, which is just the order page, taking into account different pieces that are very easily legible. They're larger, it's against a white background, there's higher contrast. So all the kind of design tips we talked about in our last week's Design Lanyard, we're employing here again in typography. Is this field of like hand lettering, probably seeing quite a bit, right? So hand lettering is super popular. There is a ton out there that you'll see in everything from magazine covers to logos. You probably remember this from the movie 27 Dresses. It's kind of everywhere now. And you know, if you want something to look hand lettered, like we always tell our students, it's best if you actually hand letter it. Trying to use a typeface, it's always going to look better if you do it by hand. And there are a ton of ways to do this. And another form of something kind of fun that's trendy right now is something called food typography. So food type you may have seen before in maybe some motion graphics or in some advertising. But this is something that's super trendy and fun, and we wanted to show you some examples here. This is a really fun composition using Lucky Charms. So you may have seen like Target, Whole Foods, a lot of great grocers and stores using this really fun food lettering for some of their ads. Toasted, which is really fun. This is very precise. And then something not as visually appealing, but once again, using what we call non-font typography, right? Food in this case for visual meaning. Okay, so that's just high level, some examples of how we use typography as designers every day. So we're going to dig in just to a very few type terms that you may have heard and may not truly understand what it means, or would like more clarification on what they mean. Okay, so you may have heard this before. So this is the difference. I'm just looking at the chat over here. So the question is hand lettering or typography downloaded, or is it a person writing it? That's a great question. So when we're talking about hand lettering, you can actually write it. A lot of people write it with maybe, let's say, a Sharpie against a white page, and then you can scan it in and digitize it. You can also use something like an iPad or a tablet where you can actually draw the lettering digitally and then bring that into your design. Yeah, so if you are doing it by hand, there are many different ways to bring it into the computer to digitize it. Okay, so we're going to talk about serif versus sans serif. So when we're looking at these, you'll notice, you've probably once again heard these terms before, but a sans serif are typically typefaces that feel more sleek and modern. They do not have serifs, which are the little finials on the ends of the letter forms. So they do not have those serifs, and usually are used for things like headlines, larger text. Also, serif, once again, has the serifs, has the finials of the letters. Serifs were a mistake, an accident at first when they were first created. The story goes that the actual serif itself was created with a chisel. So whenever masons and engravers were engraving into buildings, stone, etc., during oh my gosh, very, very early in the Roman Empire, and you would put a chisel into the stone and hit it, it would make a little mark. And then they would continue engraving or chiseling the letter forms. And so what we've learned though since then is that, I've done a ton of studies, is that the serif actually helps lead your eye from one letter form to another, which is why today we typically use serifs for longer format text. So just to give a little more context to that. Like I said, headlines, subheads, and limited body copy. Whenever you scale down, sans serif typeface is really small and you put it in a lot of body text. Studies have shown that it is harder for the human eye to read large amounts of sans serif text. So we usually tell our students, use it sparingly. right? Use it for a headline, maybe a small paragraph. But if you're typesetting an entire book or magazine article, you would probably want to use a serif typeface. Once again, because it helps in legibility and lead the eye from one letter to another. So like we just talked about, very easy to read in long format for small text. So serif versus sans serif. Are there any questions there before we move on? Okay, great. So then there is this term called leading. If you're familiar with early typesetting for, let's say, letterpress, etc., leading were physical pieces of lead that were used to space vertically the lines of text from one another. So we still use that term today. So leading refers to the line spacing. You may have heard this kind of used in programs like Word or PowerPoint, where it's single space or double space, etc., right? All of that is referring to leading. So leading is the appropriate term for that. And once again, leading just means the vertical line spacing. It says base to base, so that refers to what we call the baseline. So these orange lines refer to the baseline of this sentence of text. So base to base is what we're looking for leading. So why is leading important? So this is just, it's some placeholder text, but you can see that on the left versus the right, right? So this is not single space versus double space. This is individual little points that we've adjusted as designers. So the paragraph on the left, it's okay to read. We have it kind of large on our screen, but you can imagine if we were reading a longer format book, or let's say a poster or a magazine article, the paragraph on the right, even though it has just slightly more space in between each line, is going to be much easier for the viewer to read. Having that negative space to allow the eye to find the end and the beginning of each line is super important. So when we're looking at this over on the left, this is in shorthand as designers what we do. So over on the left, this says 12 over 14. And what that means, this little insider trick here, what that means is that 12 is the point size, right? So the size of the text, and 14 is our leading size. Over on the right, 12 is our point size and 16 is our leading size. So it's a good rule of thumb, this is a pro tip, a good rule of thumb is that you always want your leading to be at least 3 to 4 point sizes larger than your actual text size, okay? So whenever we're talking about Adobe Illustrator or InDesign and you're able to actually set your point size and your leading, you want to always make sure that your leading size is at least 3. I like 4. I like more leading. At least 3 or 4 sizes larger. So if your point size was 10 point or 11 point, right? We're looking at 13 to 14 point leading. And so once again, this is for body text or body copy as we call it. When you're looking at headlines, it really just sort of depends on what you need. And we'll get into that in a minute. But for body text, anything 12 points or lower is typically considered a body text size. If you get into 13, 14, 15 points, you're looking at more like a subhead kind of size. But anything that's 12 or lower is considered, like 10 to 12, is considered body text size. And that's when you want to keep that rule of thumb 3 to 4 points larger. If you get into like 5 or 6 points larger, you're really looking at what we would consider like a double space kind of feel. So 3 to 4 opens it up slightly and gives a little bit more air and breath in the copy. Okay, so first we had leading, first term. There will be a quiz at the end, just kidding. The second is kerning. So kerning, remember leading, and the way I remember the difference is leading starts with an L. L means line, so line spacing, leading line. Kerning is the space between the individual letter forms. So here's just a diagram showing how, look, if you look at the teal spaces, we're looking at the individual space between these letters. Sometimes you will typeset something and the spacing just feels off. Sometimes there's too much space, let's say between the K and the E or the N and the I. And you can individually in the software, and if we have time at the end, I'll show you how to do this. In the software, you can go in and you can adjust the spacing between each individual letter. That's called adjusting the kerning. That really helps with things, especially in headlines. So if you look at the left, this is just typed in default as it came in. And then you'll notice, see how here the L and the I are almost touching, the E and the A are touching, especially down here when it's much bolder. There's not enough visual, especially for typefaces that have detail. This is called an inline typeface. It has some detail in it. We would consider this more of a display face. And when you have a display face or something that has more detail, you want to open up the kerning to make it easier to read. So that's what I've done here. I've just slightly opened up the kerning. You can see how much easier it is to read the individual letter forms. Typically, when you have something like a display face, you're using it on something like a billboard, right? And people tend to think, well, it's a billboard, it's going to be huge. Of course, my viewer will be able to read it. That's not necessarily true. As we saw in our earlier example of a street sign, you're going so fast, 60, 70, 80, whatever, 90 miles an hour, right? You're not going to have a ton of time to read a billboard, as you know, as you're driving. So because you have limited text on a billboard, and let's say that you're using a font that has some sort of detail in it, right? You want to open up that kerning just a little bit to make it easier for the viewer to read. Remember, it's all about communication. So, but there is something I want to point out that we see done very frequently, and it is hard on the eye, and it is a mistake. Whenever you're opening up the kerning,
I think Dr. Garcia may have frozen up for a second, so I will try to talk about this one. Can anyone else hear her, or, no, or is she frozen for everybody? Frozen? Okay. So this is a situation where you don't want to adjust the kerning. Because script typefaces are made to connect to each other, to kind of mimic handwriting, we don't want to see these little joining places, because that looks unnatural. If you were writing this by hand with a really nice, handwriting, it would connect one letter to the other. So this is a utilitarian tool to connect them. Okay, I think she must be restarting. Thank you guys for bearing with our internet issues. Why don't I share my screen in the meantime until she gets back. Give me just 1 second to get to the right page. Okay. Okay, so here's 6 type rules to live by, and Dr. Garcia, if she comes back on, she can just take over. When we study typography in classes, we have a nice long list, but here's some just kind of 6 simple rules that are probably the most important for the everyday user. So only insert 1 space after all punctuation. So a lot of you all probably or may have learned, and I think, especially in the old MLA guidelines, to put 2 spaces in between each sentence. The reason this was done in the past was because typewriters had a monospace amount of, the days of the typewriter, there was just a consistent space between each letter. Once the computer was able to start typesetting, the spaces between the letters were customized to make them read better. So therefore, there's an automatic, consistent amount of space between sentences, which is different between the spaces between each letter. So we don't need to do the 2 spaces, but that's where it came from. So you can see this looks like a big hole. If you look at the one here, this looks a little bit nicer when you look at it. So 1 space between sentences. Use proper quotes and apostrophe marks. So a lot of times the software will do this for you, but sometimes it doesn't. So it's good to kind of take note of it. So these are what they call smart quotes, the curly quotes. This is what we want to use when we're quoting something someone said. They're kind of nicknamed dumb quotes when this is the default sometimes, especially I see this a lot in television, where you have the straight up and down quotes. They really should be curly for something someone's saying. The straight up and down indicate inches and feet, right? So we want it to be different so we know which one it's for. Okay, so here's just showing also for, you know, something like a an apostrophe mark, you want it to be curly as well. Okay, so column width in paragraph. So that's how long a paragraph is. Okay, so when lines of type are too long, it takes your eye so long to get from one side to the other, right? You have to just really work to get there. When it's too short, it's harder to read because you're constantly kind of going back and forth, jumping around, your eyes jumping around. Just right is easier because you have enough time to get to the end and then move on. So we say 66 characters is ideal of a way to get there. Also about for just one single paragraph, about 4¼ inches. The way that you can figure out what the characters are is in a program like InDesign or Adobe Illustrator, just highlight one line and then you can go to window info and you'll see how many characters. And it really does make a huge difference in how your type kind of looks on the overall flow as well. Okay, this is a big one that that students struggle with, but it really also makes a big difference. Using the proper dashes. So we have M dashes, N dashes, and then the default, which is the hyphen. And there are certain situations that you may remember from English class where you want to use each one. So an M dash can be used for certain things, like a clause where you want to stop in a sentence, like this example here. Roses are red, sometimes white, violets are blue. That's that pause. It's when we talk and we pause. So an M dash is the longer line. There's different ways to get it in the software. If you're in, again, Illustrator or InDesign, you want to go under type and then glyphs, and you can find these dashes. There's also key commands to get them. This is not correct. This is a hyphen in between. It's definitely too short. It may be confusing as looks like a connected word, right? And then it's also an M dash is used if it's a quote and it's who's saying the quote. Again, this is the incorrect version. Okay, and an N dash is used to denote a duration of time. This, of course, we use a lot in things like invitations. So from one date to another. So Monday to Wednesday, N dash, same with times. Again, this is the incorrect on the bottom. Oh, and here's Dr. Garcia is adding the key commands of how you get the M dash and the N dash. And the hyphen is just press the hyphen button. Okay, avoid widows and orphans. And this may be a term that you haven't heard before. And sometimes they're interchanged, but basically a widow is one little word that's left behind at the end of a paragraph, right? So think of it as if it was 2 words, it would be a couple, and that's okay. 1 word is a widow left all by themselves. And this just doesn't really look as good. The other, and this is an orphan. So an orphan is in columns of type when you have, you flow from the end of one paragraph to where another paragraph starts. You want to have at least 2 lines if you can, ideally 2 lines. But if you just have 1, you definitely want it to be a full line because this kind of just hanging here by itself. It almost looks like it's a heading, but it's not. It's really the finishing of the sentence from the one before. Okay, so this is just an example showing of, you know, how it looks. Can't you see that the one on the top looks better than the one on the bottom with this awkward little widow hanging out and the orphan by itself? It just doesn't quite make as much sense. Okay, use proper indentions. So you either want to have an indent in between paragraphs, right? To indicate that it's a new paragraph. When you're reading, you know that that's a new paragraph, like obviously like a novel or something is gonna just have an indent. You can also have a hard return or a space in between paragraphs, but you don't want to do both. If you have an indent, don't also have a hard return in a space. Choose one or the other. Choose the indent or choose the space, but not both. You also don't want to indent the first paragraph, like of something that you're starting. Okay, so combining typefaces. And I think this is something that everybody uses, no matter if you're, using Microsoft Word or if you're using some of our design software like InDesign and Illustrator. Something like a resume, something where you want to set things off, you will combine two different typefaces or fonts. So here's just some kind of pro tips on ways to choose. How do you decide what two typefaces to use? Now, for those of you who are in our session last week, we talked about the 4 basic design principles. And the first one was contrast. So contrast is, in design, we want to make things have a hierarchy of importance, right? To know which one to read first, then second, and also just to set apart from each other so we can figure out where the content should be. So in this instance, we want to pick two typefaces with the most contrast possible, okay? So one way to do it is to make them, to have things have contrast. They need to be different, very different. So combining a sans serif with a serif. So you guys just learned about what the differences were. So in this example, the sans serif is combined, and on the one on the left, it's 2 sans serifs, right? The one on the right is a sans serif and a serif, and they look a little more different, and so it works better. So avoid similar classifications. So what this means is that what we call this kind of typeface, it's sort of, I know it looks like a serif, it is, but we call it a slab serif because the actual feet of the serif is like a more rectangular slab-like shape. So this, even though they're 2 different slab serifs, they're still both slab serifs. So to make them even have more contrast and more hierarchy, this is combining a slab serif with just a regular serif. Okay, and then have contrast in the font weights. So what weight means is, weight is talking about how thick a stroke is. So the stroke are the different pieces. Can y'all see my mouse? The different pieces of the typeface, right? So the one on the left, the headline on the left is very thin. It's a thin weight. The one on the right is a thick weight. So if you look at this, even though the headline on the left is obviously is set in a much larger font size than the body copy down here, the actual weight of the two is about the same. Okay, so like, even though this is much smaller, the weight of the individual letters is the same as the heading. So this one has more contrast because the headline is not only larger, but it's also thicker. Okay, and this is a good rule of thumb in general in design. When you're designing, keep it simple. Just use 2 different typefaces. Now, and the last time we talked a little bit about type families. So when you think of using 2 different typefaces, don't feel like you're really limited. A lot of good typefaces they're called a type family because that includes like their italic version and their bold, and sometimes they have a small caps and different variations. So if you choose 2 type families that have a lot of variations, then you have more choices, but it is just kind of easier to figure out and to navigate if you just stick with 2 type families. Okay, so again, back to the contrast, use different point sizes, make a headline or heading larger than the body copy, because especially if you have multiple headings or subheads, we want to be able to quickly skim it and figure it out. And so making them bigger and set apart is one way to do that. So here's a student example of mixing 2 different typefaces to help deliver the message effectively. So she's trying to communicate trick-or-treat safety tips, excuse me. So she's actually choosing to highlight of these, tips, she's choosing to highlight one word that we can remember. Be visible, stay, don't go inside. So she's using a contrast between a kind of funky Halloween typeface and just a simple sans serif. Okay, and so now just here are some more examples. Okay, and y'all may remember this one from last week as well. I think this is a really nice example because it's showing how contrast is used and how just type alone can tell a story or send a message. So the word tonnage really feels big and heavy. It's got a really thick weight of it. It's also running vertical instead of horizontal. And then just what they're doing here with the very light type and smaller type is kind of popping out. This example is just, again, usually you don't want to put two typefaces on top of each other because it does make it hard to read. But in this case, that's what the message is supposed to be, right? Good design is invisible. And then the one on top, good design is obvious. So you can see that because they used a little bit of a transparency and two very different typefaces, right? They almost couldn't be more different. One is script, one is heavy and outlined, almost looks three-dimensional. So they're contrasting each other and the message works. This is another student example of just that, even on a poster that only has or basically just has type, it also includes circles, but it can be really fun and have movement, but still be very organized and easy to go through, right? So this was the rules for type, of which we highlighted 6, but you can see here is many more, and this is a class project that they do. But it's still fun and has movement, and you can easily navigate it by just kind of going from one number to the other, and we know what's the most important part of the rule. We can see that because of our contrast, right? It's larger, it's in bold, and then the kind of nitty-gritty stuff that we need to read is smaller and it's right underneath it. But they're all connected by this number and the really fun circles. So here's another example of a book jacket. In this example, I think I like to show examples where type alone can really tell a story. And then, we have an arrow here, but it's making up the letter N is one cool thing of what is happening here. And then also, why it's set to going upward, right? Going vertically. So sort of showing the idea of a rebound, showing the movement of what it's trying to say. Okay, and this example is used to talk about type hierarchy, right? The order of importance. Think of it the ranking system. You need to see one thing on a page first, then something else second and third. So the one on the left, it looks pretty good. On Pins and Needles, that's the name of the title of the play, but it definitely looks better on the right for a couple reasons. One, it's much larger and we know to look there first, right? We don't get confused, oh, what exactly am I supposed to be looking at? But even just the way they placed it by putting the ampersand in the middle and just kind of making it look like more of a dynamic unit makes it more interesting to look at. And then we know, okay, let's go down. This is maybe the mood. The picture kind of gives us a feeling for the, what mood or style that the play is going to be in. And then the when and the where is all secondary information underneath. So this example is another student example, student Katie Stern, and she redesigned this menu for a local restaurant, the Bywater American Bistro. And there's a couple different ways that she's using type successfully here. So again, she's using just 2 type families, but you can see how different they look. Like, look how different the italic looks, than the just regular plain typeface, right? And then she's using the script for the titling. It's easy to navigate, to figure out, okay, maybe I might want to get duck breast. Okay, here's the description underneath. I know this seems obvious and we're used to seeing it, but it really does take some kind of figuring out to decide how's the price going to be? How's everything going to be categorized together to really make sense? And then how to get other visual elements in without taking away from the readability. And so she's done that very nicely by having the imagery just kind of screened, is what we call it, just like a percentage of the picture behind the type. So you can still read it and it's still interesting to look at. This example I like because it shows that type can work with imagery. So the marionette that, we can imagine it kind of moving, the strings are attaching it, and they're doing that with the way the type is moving in the headline. And this is introducing a longer story, right? So, sometimes when you're reading a magazine, there's this one really interesting spread, the 2 pages together, and then you flip and see more of the story. So that's what this is. This is a student example student Kathy Hume. She just did this last semester. And so this was, you know, an exercise in getting students to think about a lot of the things we just talked about. You know, what's the ideal line length to make these columns the easiest to read, right? And to look the nicest. This, we talked in the very beginning about how hand lettering is kind of like a trendy thing. And why it can work really well is it can be merged really nicely with illustration. She's a really great illustrator. And so what she did was she took actually an existing typeface and she traced it and modified it and made it look really custom. And that's all part of the big overall image to introduce this article. And then she used, you know, just regular typesetting for the end, which in and of itself is a lot of work. And you can see, like, she never has a widow, right? She's got, this looks small, but she's got 2 words here. She always has the 2 words, not just the one, no orphans. Okay, this is in the typography class, an example of one of the exercises that we do just to work on combining typefaces, right? How do you pick 2 typefaces and make them work well together? And how do you set them in a way that the viewer knows, you know, where to go and how to get the information? So in this interview, the challenge was to really figure out what's the question, what's the answer. And so this was done by using color, by using 2 different type families. One is sans serif, one is serif. And she chose to indent, having the question be like an outdent, I guess you would call it. And then everything else line up against a certain line. So then it's really obvious what's the question, what's the answer. And then even she separates the introductory paragraph by, again, this is still only 2 typefaces. This is just the italic version of her serif typeface. And then she also ties in color. You know, you can see she's got 3 colors, the black, the red, and the green, and she ties it in, you know, language. That's what she's using, the same green color for the questions. This example is we also talked about last week. It's just merging how much fun you can have with type, and how, you know, type and image can interact together. I love how this 6 goes around her leg, but we know it's a list of the different fashion elements. So white coat is, you know, next to the white coat, next to the number 5. And then they're still choosing pieces and parts to highlight within there. So the white pant is in a serif, right? And then the sans serif is kind of how they're starting to introduce it. So you can see the mixing and matching that's happening there. And this one we also showed you guys. This is a student example that we really love. This was, I think, I want to say maybe even her first shot at hand lettering, and she has, you know, done a lot more since then. She really loves it. But this was for the Muffalata Festival. This is student Lauren Debat. So again, she wanted to kind of match the style of the big Muffalata drawing that she did with the information that she wanted to put in the text. So she did a hand letter just like you would have on, you know, like when you get a po' boy or something and you see the writing on the bag. I think that's kind of what she was going with. But you can see even in just kind of like the crazy chaotic look of this, all the pertinent information is together. The time and the date. What exactly is on the Muffalata? You know, who's going to be the music and the celebrate, you know, all that kind of information. Okay, and I don't know if Dr. Garcia has made it back, but we really appreciate you guys joining us. You can get information on any of the other sessions by going back to the events page. Please register. We have 2 more left. I think we have Samantha Barnes. Professor Barnes is going to do the next one. Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about what it's going to be, just to?
Yeah, so we're going to be doing, I believe it's intro to UX. We're going to be doing a little bit of XD, basics of XD, and going over just ways that XD helps benefit interactive design. And I'm actually really excited because XD just recently, in the last 6 months, released new transitions. So you can do even more with it that you can't do with, sorry, Dr. Garcia's message caught me off guard. You can do even more than you can do with Sketch. So it's pretty exciting. And yeah, so that should be next week.
Awesome. Thanks again, guys. Sorry, my I think some people are streaming in my household, so I got kicked off accidentally. But thank you again so much for joining us today. And if you go to that website, digitaldesign.tulane.edu/events, you can register for the next couple of events coming up, and check out additional ones coming up after the XD event. We're going to have a Procreate, which is kind of like you just saw for the Muffalata. If you want to go back a slide, Rebecca, you can see how Lauren DeBott used what is called Procreate, which is a piece of software on the iPad Pro to actually create this illustration and the hand lettering that we were talking about earlier. So we're going to be doing that in 2 weeks. If you're interested, it should be a lot of fun. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much again. We're going to end a little early today, and we'll send out this recording to y'all so you can review all of these fun rules, tips, and tricks. Thank you.